Hi, everyone. Got John here and David here. We're going to talk about some of the playtest stuff that's going out right now, the OneD&D playtest, the Black Flag playtest. We were just talking about our hobby stores growing up. And I'd love to hear a real quick recount of that one, John.
So this would have been early 80s, 81, 82. And I was in Rochester, New York, and there was a little store there called Campaign Headquarters. And it was on the far side of town. And so I would always have to ask my parents to take me on a drive that would take us, at least an hour. And we'd go there, and the store would have just a couple of like spinner racks of books and adventures and a selection of the game, the Steve Jackson stuff. I got Car Wars there too because those were really inexpensive. But a couple of modules, and then maybe one 4x8 sheet of pegboard with minis hung on it. And the guy couldn't even afford heat, so in the winter he'd spend the whole day just huddled in his parka, keeping the place open and trying to make ends meet. And now the stores are massive and really, really cool. The production quality of everything is so much better. It's a much better time to be a gamer.
That's true. Tell us about yours, David.
Yeah, people in the Chicago area might know of the Hobby Chest. That was this old building, and there was a place in it that was stocked with all sorts of games. This was more of a deep, broad selection place where there was everything reeked of cigarette smoke, and there were naughty miniatures painted on display, and that made it seem even more exciting. And I got so many copies of classic, very early things like this Arduin behind my back that I put on display because I was thinking about games that are D&D but better today for some reason. Not necessarily actually better, but an attempt by somebody passionate about the hobby to create D&D, but patch it up to make all the things better.
My game store was Merlin's at a place called the Flour Mill. So it was an old flour mill that had been repurposed into a little shopping area. And they had a game store in there. One day, my mom was shopping in there for some reason. And I saw this game store, and I'm like, what is this? This is amazing, magical place. And sometimes they'd play D&D. The owners of the game store had the Pizza Hut that was also in the flour mill. And I'd see them play in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And I always wanted to get in on that game. And I'd ride the bus down there after school. I lived all the way across town. I'd get on the bus after school, go down there, hang out for a couple hours, and my mom would pick me up after she got off work. Yeah, those were fun times back then when the stores were like little. You had to find them.
Mm-hmm.
It was like a quest to find your game store.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Okay, so let's look at the playtest stuff. We got two things coming out. We got the Druid and Paladin. Let me just share my screen here. Druid and Paladin. There we go. All right. So the Druid and Paladin playtest has been out for a little bit, but it's going to the survey stage now. And interestingly, they did a video, which I really appreciate, about their thoughts on the feedback they've gotten, their thoughts on some of the reasons they did some of the things in the playtest. So we're going to talk about that today. And then we also have the Black Flag playtest, and they did the same thing. Let me share that tab there, where they have a design diary, which again, really appreciated. Really neat to see what the thoughts are behind the playtest. So let's start with the OneD&D playtest. Again, the Druid and Paladin survey is available, and some things I picked up from going through their Q&A that they kind of did, and I think you pointed this out, John, was the stat blocks for the animals or the wild shape forms, and doing something to make them feel more like animals, more like creatures that could do things. And Jeremy talked a lot about how they might do that, or they might go back to where you become real animals, but maybe with a curated list for new players. So here's 10 most common animals that you might want to turn into. And I don't know if those stat blocks would appear in the player's handbook or not, but that's another idea for what they had there. And then also for the Druid, they talked about level 1 Druids wild shaping being half an hour. They talked about the tiny, not being able to become tiny until you're higher level, and how a lot of people want that back. And so that might become like one of their little stat block editions where they have a tiny stat block, and then they could do it earlier. And they talked about the shield, or they talked about the abjuration spells in your wild shape form, and how shield was one that's brought up. And that just brings up shield's by far one of the best spells in the game. So maybe they just need to change shield a little bit.
Shield needs some tweaking for
Yeah.
sure.
What are your thoughts on that stuff, John?
You know, there was I found that the interview in the video was just, it's really gratifying to hear the way they think about this stuff and the way they use both paying attention to what's going on out here in the pundit verse, and also the data that they're getting back. I mean, they're paying attention to a lot of different channels, and I think that I find that satisfying. That makes me feel good about it. And there's some of the stuff, the way they talked about the class results later on was really good, but especially with the Druid thing, they're really looking at making big changes because the Druid class is the least played, and that I think says a lot about their focus and what they're trying to do. I still think it's a really interesting question about whether you create these sort of standardized stat blocks, or if you just let everybody, choose from a selection of animals. I think that there's maybe a relatively happy medium that they'll land on, but I just find the openness to the conversation that they're demonstrating great.
I agree. Yeah. You said two things. You said the pundit verse, which clearly they're listening to because there hasn't been a survey, and they're already bringing up a lot of things that people are talking about on the Druid. And then, of course, the survey data, which they get a lot more data there. So it's important to kind of do both, I think, a little bit.
Oh, yeah. We definitely got the theme that, hey, despite the rumors you've heard, we are really listening to the feedback that we're getting in the surveys in particular, and even folks who are just spouting off on the internet.
And how nice for them to have said that. I mean, especially after the beginning of the year, I think it makes things feel really positive.
And I'm reassured that they're listening, because it sounds like they're going to try and find a happy medium between the here's your monster manual, this is your guide to playing the Druid, and here's 3 sort of flavorless stat blocks that make playing the Druid simple but not very rewarding. So I think there's a lot of room in between there to find a good spot.
Okay, the next we got the Paladin, and for the Paladin they had clarification that you can smite with Divine Smite. They talked a lot about the bow and smiting with the bow, and I think a little bit like shield, it's more a problem with ranged attacks than it is a problem with the Paladin smiting with ranged attacks. That was about it for what they talked about on the Paladin. What are you guys' thoughts on those things?
I found it interesting that they did mention that if Paladins keep the smite, they would be considering changing the damage formulas for those ranged smites if Paladins keep ranged smites. And that was sort of the first indication that I've heard from the design team that they do recognize that range attacks do have an advantage over melee attacks, and it's not just a Coke versus Pepsi sort of flavor thing that they're trying to protect the Paladins or protect the Rangers' domain of what they can do from range.
Yeah, I think Jeremy was pretty clear in indicating that they're going to look at the data and stuff like that, but he personally doesn't like the range smite thing. But it's interesting that they would put something in the packet to let people chew on it that they're really not sure about. It's like, hey, see what they say about this. And I think that's also, again, reminds us that it's very much experimental.
Yeah, that's a good sign too. I mean,
yeah,
they're not holding back on things that they don't like necessarily completely.
And put me on the almost inevitably losing smite should not crit team. This.
Yep.
Yeah,
We'll
you
just count
kinda,
that as a win against you right now, Dave. There's no
sorry,
way you're winning that one.
you lost that fight already.
I suspect so.
I mean, it's all about. I mean, in the end, playing a paladin is about that moment where you get that crit and you can pile all that damage on it, and that's you take that away, and the class will become much less fun to play.
This is
That
true. A lot of
that
folks who
does
play
that does bring
paladins
up
play
something I
that
was
moment.
thinking of this morning, though, is that okay, you give them crit, but then you take away the chance to smite on a second hit because it's once per round. So now, how bad are they going to feel if they crit on their second hit
Mhm.
and they already used their smite?
Should have
So
saved it.
yeah, should have saved it. Now they don't use it at all.
Right.
So I could see where I don't know. You want to not let them smite, then they can smite every time. And they'll feel bad, but then they'd be mad that they can't crit on a smite sometimes.
I do like limiting smite to once a round, and that you
It
can't
needed that.
smite and
Yeah.
cast. Uh,
So we're playing like 10th level characters right now in our own game, right? And the paladin's doing pretty strong, but the action surging fighters and barbarians are keeping right up because that's a lot of attacks that they get. So it's interesting if they do too much to rein in the paladin, be careful about the fighters being way out there on damage they can put out, or the barbarians, with action surge reckless attacks.
yeah, I mean, I think that there's the a lot of it is just action economy stuff there. That action surge is one round. Now it's a very good round, that
Yeah.
first round of battle, but and it's more flexible. So
Hmm.
like if you need to do something other than attack, you can do that too with action surge. While smite is a hammer, and it's only good for nails.
Yeah.
Um,
So then next they talked about going back to their expert classes playtest and the feedback they got on that. And the feedback was people mostly like bards, except for missing the additional magical secrets that went away.
mhm,
People mostly like rangers, except for the multi-attack options under the hunter, which lost some of its options. And they said the easy thing there is just bring those back. So I don't know if they'll just bring them back or how they'll balance that exactly. And then interestingly, the rogue was the least liked, and it's because they took away the off-turn sneak attack.
yeah,
So they're saying, well, we'll just put that back in. And they also talked a little bit about the fast hands and what exactly can fast hands do. And that's always been a problem since day one. I always liked the thief subclass for rogues,
right.
but that was always a sticking point. What could you do with that fast hands? What do you think, John?
Well, I love to play rogues, and so as a DM, I'm always like, uh, I tend to be pretty liberal with what fast hands can do, just because that's what I would want to do. But at the same time, a lot of the stuff that delivers magic or damage, you wouldn't want to allow because it does break the action economy. So I think that they do need to be more clear, come up with a way to be more clear in it. Um, it may be a question of things like, do they want to define it as create an action type that is to manipulate an object using thievery or sleight of hand, or something like that. So you wouldn't be able to use those skills to deliver a potion to somebody or throw alchemist's fire at somebody, but you might be able to open a lock or open a door or something like that. So unless you have a mechanism that delivers the potion into somebody.
So
Or use an alchemist.
there's an action called magic. We can make an action called theft. I'm just
Yeah,
There you
joking,
go.
obviously, because I
yeah.
think that magic action name is kind of dumb. But
Now, just for a moment, try and imagine the very measured, buttoned up Jeremy Crawford positively giddy. He seemed positively giddy about the Ranger scoring in the 80% as opposed to the 50% range as it
Yeah.
has in the past.
Yeah, no, he was very, very pleased with the way it rated.
yeah, he didn't really go into a lot of detail of exactly why. He talked about in general it was good, and I don't know if maybe everyone liked the Hunter's Mark feature, or what do you guys think everyone liked the most about the Ranger? making Hunter's Mark kind of a class feature instead of a spell, but it's still a spell. It's just that you always have it prepared,
Right.
and you don't concentrate.
Yeah, I think making it not concentration is a big step.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The roving part that they took from Tasha's, I think, that really gave some versatility to the Ranger, giving him climb speed and swim speed. And Tireless also. Those are up there, though. They're up there at 7th and 11th levels. So, I mean, I liked them overall, too, for sure. Okay, that's our Ranger. Anything else on OneD&D before we go on to Black Flag?
Look at my notes real quick. I think I was mostly just, again, gratified at the listening to the way they think about the data and the way they make determinations. It's fascinating to listen to the way they find the story of what's going on through the data. I think it's really, it's a nice little class in data analysis, just sitting there listening to it.
Yeah, it reassures me a little bit about what they're doing.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't too open about how they were doing it or what they were using, and I think a lot of people were unsure and therefore unhappy a little bit with it. And this makes it a little better sounding.
And it's an entertaining watch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Then let's go to the Black Flag playtest. Share this tab instead. So we got playtest packet number 2. They talk about in their design diary things that they've learned. So lineage and heritage, they need to just, fine tune the balance, obviously. They talked about presenting the heritage options differently. And if you recall, heritage is like sub-race in 2014 D&D. They're ready to let go of PC alignment. They don't say they're discarding it completely, but as a core element of character creation, discarding it. Don't want to choose between ability score increases and choosing a talent. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And again, balancing the talent options. So in general, playtest packet 1, would you say those are the kind of things you saw, or was there anything else that came to mind?
Sure. There wasn't a lot in that first playtest packet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty short. So in 2, they tried to give us a little bit more meat to look at. So we got a replacement for inspiration. That's using a mechanic called luck. This is somewhat similar to hero points in that you can have multiples of them. They add to the roll, except they add a set number to the roll equal to how many luck points you want to spend. And you have a maximum number of luck points that you can have, which same for hero points. We'll look at that in detail in a second. We got other changes. So fighters, they get strength or dex saves. They talk about last stand replacing second wind. And this is interesting. So I caught that it replaced second wind, and I caught it was a reaction, but I didn't think of why. And the reason they're giving is, well, okay, if you're the fighter and you're about to go down, this is the way you can stop yourself from going down. So last stand, which is pretty cool, I think. Now, there's a lot of things that compete for reactions, so that might get chewed up and then you can't do it, which would be a bummer.
Well, and it's not, because it happens when you pass half of your hit points, not all the way down. And I don't remember a limit on the number of times a day you could do it, except for your limit of hit dice.
Let's take a look. Yeah. So last stand, here it is. We take damage that reduces your hit points to an amount less than half your hit point maximum rounded down. That I would think means you could use it anytime you take damage, not the time that it drops you below half, but any time that you would be below half after the damage. You think that's what they intend?
Yeah.
So all the way down to 0.
Yeah, but I mean, so you don't have to use it when you're about to get dropped. It's just when you're at some point get taken a beating.
Yeah.
But it does. I was wrong about the limitations on use. It's just
once per long rest. Yeah. And you can get a lot of hit points back. However many hit dice you have. You give up the calm modifier in every hit die, so you wouldn't want to do this in place of a short rest if you can avoid it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Although I would want to see the rules for recovery to see if they're and gaining hit points. I mean, So when we use hit dice to recover,
Yeah.
do you get the con bonus per die?
Good question. I don't know. I don't think we've seen them. I mean, it makes sense why they'd make this slightly different if they didn't want you to just,
Yeah.
use up your hit dice and say, oh, this is just as good as resting. I might as well do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that was Last Stand. Martial actions replacing fighting style. This is interesting. So they're trying to do a more active fighting style, is what they're saying in those comments. And so they have these different martial actions that go along with a ranged weapon. So what's the fighting style for a ranged weapon? It's +2 to attack in 5e, right? So in this one, it is you spend a bonus action, double your proficiency bonus for the first attack roll. So it's only +2 to attack for one roll at first level, for one roll, and it costs bonus action. So a lot more expensive to do for a character than just getting a +2 all the time.
Right.
Now, in theory, once you're 5th level or higher, you're getting a little bit better bonus on one attack. Guard requires a shield and does basically what the reaction, the protection fighting style did. Quick strike requires 2 weapons, so that's like 2-weapon fighting style. Interesting. What do you guys think of that?
Well, I'm a little bit puzzled about their seeming reliance on deciding that they're going to start using doubling the proficiency bonus as a mechanic. It seems like it's too weak at lower levels and too good at higher levels. With the bounded accuracy numbers that the whole system is built on, I think it makes more sense to just have +4, +3, something like that, instead of trying to scale it up.
Yeah.
But
plus 10 by the time, or no, +8 by the time you're what?
Yeah.
9th level. That's a pretty big bonus.
Yeah.
That's the type of bonus that makes you not ever miss.
True.
No one likes missing.
No one likes missing.
We'll talk about that in a second too.
Talk about that.
Let's go back. I guess we could just go into the rules as we talk about these things. So let's go backwards a little bit and let's talk about the luck mechanic. Okay. Oh, one nice thing they did talk about in the playtest packet itself, which they didn't talk about in the design guide diary, is what you combine it with. So this is kind of important. This is kind of something I'm seeing as I'm doing all these playtests. What do we keep from the old rules and use with the new rules, and what's their intent for, what's still compatible and what's not compatible and going to get it revised. So I do a little bit of talk about that, which is good. Okay, so our luck points. After you make a roll, before the DM declares whether the roll succeeds or fails, you can use a luck point. I'd like to see this after you know you fail. I don't like that mechanic where there's supposed to be a pause between you telling the DM what you got and the DM saying yes or no. Because then that just pauses the game all the time.
Yeah, it really is a drag.
And it doesn't work in things like Fantasy Grounds where the system tells you whether you hit as soon as you roll.
Yeah.
So there's just some places where you play where that's not even feasible.
Yeah. It doesn't change a nat 1 or a nat 20. You can use up to 3 of them to re-roll, or you can use one at a time to increase on a 1-for-1 basis what your roll was. So it's a little weak, I think. I mean, if you're using 1, you don't often fail by 1. And how often do you know you failed by 1?
That's what I'm uncomfortable with on this whole thing, is the sort of guessing game about how many points you need, and worrying about spending points and then not getting a success. That would, you think it's a bummer to miss. It's a bummer to miss, spend some points, and then succeed and then fail still. Wow, what a downer moment at the table.
Yeah.
But I'd like to take a moment to kind of zoom back a little bit about what I like and what I don't like about this mechanic. And that it kind of ties into what we were talking about. Nobody likes to miss. With OneD&D, they seem to be aiming the inspiration, the heroic inspiration, just with that sort of goal of making sure that no one fails. And I understand that failing isn't fun in the game, but I still like to see that chance, so that sometimes folks might fail a save or something like that. You get that occasional step back. And maybe that's just my taste, but it seems like the design is really leaning towards designing a system where people seldom fail very much on their D20 tests. Here, I like the mechanic where you're gaining these points after missing rolls in succession. So it's kind of like if you get a bunch of misses, then, or you get a bunch of failed tests, then you get these points and your luck changes. And I kind of like that because well, missing once is fine, you know, but missing 5 times in a row, that's a real downer. So I do like that aspect where it builds up and then you're encouraged to use it by rolling the die. But I think it could be a little fussy and slow. So I guess it bears testing. That's what the behind the curtain says. Don't judge this until you test it.
Right.
I think there's a bigger problem with it. And I'm curious about the fussiness of it and remembering to give yourself the luck points and all of that stuff is challenging. But this is going to really heavily favor melee classes that do a lot of attacks. You know, your monk who gets all of those bonus attacks is going to generate a lot of luck very, very quickly. And your, spellcasters that don't make attack rolls and aren't often the targets of attacks that require saves unless they're being specifically targeted by the enemy. Your support classes have a lot less opportunity to generate luck. And that's going to be a big inequity in the game that they're going to have to find a way to deal with. So I prefer systems that are less tied to combat and especially tied to that attack roll, which is, what most people are making most of the time. I struggle with that piece of it.
Yeah,
Great
that's
observation.
a really good point. And the OneD&D playtest had the same mechanic where you get a 1, you get inspiration, and everyone rightly pointed out, well, if you're making lots and lots of attacks, you can get it more often than if you don't, just like you just said. Yeah. And they abandoned it in the later playtests. Okay, so that's luck points. We started talking about Last Stand. We started talking about fighting styles. And then let's see what they got next. So multi-attack, they call extra attack multi-attack, just so you know it's not an extra attack action. Okay. Fighter subclasses are called disciplines. Improvement replaces ability score improvement. So this is a big one. So here you can see in their improvement at 4th level and 8th level, you get to increase one ability score by 1. And then you choose a talent. So it kind of is like every talent is balanced to go with a +1 ability score of some sort.
Have they been copying from the OneD&D paper?
Yeah. And then you can take a talent that gives you another +1. So you can get the +2. Or basically it's like you either have the +2 or any other talent gives you a +1. And that's kind of what D&D is going for. It kind of matches OneD&D as far as when you get increased ability scores. So, any thoughts there?
I'm sort of meh on that whole thing.
Yeah.
I worry that the design space will be too limiting and the talents will have to be too similarly powered if they're each equal to a +1 to an attribute.
Well, I think they're aiming to make them equal to a +2 to an attribute, but
well, no, because this comes with a +1 to an attribute and
I get it.
Talent.
Yeah, it's a good point because basically, are they going to try and balance them so they're all equal to this, which you could take instead? Like you're saying, John, they got to make them all equal to this talent right here, +1 to an ability score. Or you would never take this one, but maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay you don't take that one, and you find some that maybe they're all better than that one, and it'd be rare that you'd ever do this unless you had that one ability score that was an odd number that you wanted that +1 for.
Well, and it eliminates the possibility of having a talent that is so strong that you wouldn't want to combine it with the normal +1 at that level for the improvement stage. you know, some of the stuff like sharpshooter that is a gimme, you know, that everybody takes if they're a ranged fighter.
Hmm.
I would think you would want to make it more expensive, and so this limits their design space a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so that's talents, ability score improvements. Wizards no longer have weapon proficiencies. I didn't pick that up. They separated rituals out. Okay, here, speaking of copying from OneD&D, no spell lists or no class specific spell lists. They have generic spell lists. And we've talked a little bit about why that can be an issue in a lot of cases. So we'll talk about that again here in a second. They have a feature called Magic Sense, which is mimicking detect magic.
I like that.
Yeah, which everyone casts, but now it's not a ritual anymore because it's a one action casting. So now you'd have to spend a slot for it. So they gave you, instead of power, that does it. You get your subclass at third instead of second. So they're standardizing subclasses.
Hmm.
And same thing with improvement. Okay, so let's look at that. Back to the wizard.
Yeah, I hadn't even noticed the weapon proficiency thing, but then
Weapons done. Yeah.
if you're a wizard and you're using a crossbow, you're doing it wrong, right?
Pretty much, yeah. It's funny. I mean, it's like you never see them ever do it, and now they're really never going to do it.
And that's okay.
Yeah. Okay, so rituals are separated out.
See, I've always loved the idea of rituals, and I don't think 5e does them very well. I'd love to see more ritual spells, especially at higher levels. I'd love to see rules for more complex rules around rituals, how to do them, how to design them, how to use them in play. I think there's just a ton of I mean, it's one thing we all write adventures and stuff like that, and you know, create a quote unquote ritual that needs to get disrupted, but it's really just a ticking clock mechanic. It's not really something that might happen. It's just, or you know, if the adventurers somehow lose the adventure, that would be a possibility there. But if we can create some real mechanics for it, then it's something that players might be using to try and proactively build towards a resolution that isn't just go into the castle and beat the snot out of people. And so I think that there's just tons of possibilities around this stuff that really honor magic and the ideas of magic from, you know, lots of different storylines and intellectual properties and stuff like that. And I just feel like both OneD&D and this are just sort of like scratching the surface of what we could be doing.
The challenge of rituals has always been that anything that's available to the players as a ritual, as long as there's no particular time pressure, it's essentially an at-will magical effect. So you can cast that if you're not feeling urgency in D&D, you can always cast that detect magic over and over again. It's at will, and that's why you don't start to see them come up at higher levels. But certainly, if you found other ways to,
I think that would have to be necessary. That you would have to build mechanics around. Like maybe if you're working on a ritual, that's concentration. You're maintaining that concentration, so there's no resting. There's no casting other concentration spells. Maybe it, you know, perpetually takes at least some action to be working on the ritual, and then the results, you need to scale those, and there also needs to be expensive components and all that sort of thing. I mean, there's, and again, maybe that is less fun. I don't know. I could just be a wanker on that one, but I feel like there's just a lot of potential there.
Agreed.
So you'll like this, David. They didn't bring back, but they keep the being able to prepare any spell you want. Your intelligence modifier plus your wizard level. That's the same in 5e. OneD&D is going to, you look at your table and say you're a 5th level wizard, you can prepare 4 firsts, 3 seconds, and 2 thirds. You can cast them in any slot, but those are the ones you can prepare. And when you only have one of your highest level slot, you don't have a lot of versatility in what you prepare. Whereas if you are allowed just an open list of any spell you can cast, then that's, I think, a lot better.
I hadn't noticed that in the previous packets.
Yeah, in OneD&D, yeah, you don't get a number of spells to prep. Your number of spells, like if your 5th level, would be 8 or 9, and they'd have to be 4 of that level, 3 of that level, and 2 of that level.
Well, I hope that goes away.
Yeah, it's not as good, I don't think.
It's simple, but
It's simple, but yeah, it's kind of like the pain of I saw looking at Pathfinder, where it's even worse. Where it's like you prep these spells at those levels, and that's the level you cast them at.
Yeah.
And if you want to cast the same spell twice, you have to prep it twice. So that was terrible, I thought. Hopefully they'll change that someday.
There are mechanics where if it's a signature spell, you can cast it at any level.
Mm-hmm.
Pathfinder 2, in classes that get signature spells.
Yeah.
I'm playing a bard and I do, but that's, again, it's very limited.
So that's a 5e mechanic. I think it's not broken. I'm glad that they're staying with it. Rituals, you gotta have rituals. We talked about that. Copy spells in your spell book. For some reason, I'm thinking this used to cost 100 gold in 5e, but I didn't go double check it. Maybe it is 50 in 5e. Magic Sense. So at 2nd level, you can, as an action, proficiency bonus +1 times prolonged rest, cast basically Detect Magic. Because now Detect Magic is no longer a ritual because it's a 1-action spell. So there's that improvement. We know battle mages add martial to their talent list they can pick from.
it's interesting that these subclasses are not magical schools.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They are actual sort of variants of power sets.
Right, because if you look back at Playtest 1, there were basically talents that were mimicking what the schools did. And you could basically get the same effect as if you had a school with talents, and then this gives a different thing of, different types of magic users instead of by school. And they have that one. They have the Cantrip Adept.
Can you scroll back up? I was looking at that spell ward. That's awfully cool.
Yeah. So this is like the mirror for the Abjuration Wizard, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's essentially a better version of Mage Armor, right?
Bonus to armor class equal to proficiency. So yeah, it's a little bit, and it probably stacks with Mage Armor as well.
Probably. Well, then also resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing.
Yeah.
And that's not non-magical. That's all of it.
Yeah. Doesn't say non-magic. Magical. Yeah.
How long does it last?
A minute.
A minute.
Okay.
So battle.
So a battle.
It ends if you're knocked unconscious or if your turn ends and you haven't cast a spell of the first ring or higher since your last turn.
Oh, that's a big asterisk.
Yeah. So if you can't do that and then just plink with cantrips. You have to be pretty actively burning resources to keep it up. But that's a fun thing. I mean, it's similar to Rage, but the Wizards version.
Mm-hmm. Tactical Caster is similar to the Evoker's ability to exclude people from their spells.
I was interested that, and I don't know if it's intentional, but you can make people immune to the damage caused by the spell, but not the effects.
Right. So if you're like
you have
average
something
black
that,
tentacles, you could still get grappled.
right.
Yeah.
Still, with this War Mage, there's so much spicy stuff in there that it's hard to imagine that the other specialties could be as compelling.
Cantrip Adept,
Just
speaking
for
of their
NPCs. The other
specialties.
specialties are for NPCs.
Bonus action spell every round with one of your cantrips, but only proficiency bonus per long rest. And then gain 2 cantrips of any circle. So that's going to up your different spells you can cast. Add proficiency bonus to 1 damage roll. Yeah, it doesn't feel anywhere quite as good as the cool things you get with Battle Master or Battle Mage. Okay, and then talents. So we talked about how they had to balance this basically to make it the same as a +1 ability score increase or better. Evidently, they're making them mostly better, I think. Let's go back and see what they talk about here. That's Wizards. What are they working on next? So they want to get a catalog of martial talents, and they want the martial talents to be a long list, double the length of the magical talent list, because casters already have their spells to choose, and fighter types would have this list to choose from. Re-examine the way base weapons, equipment, and armor work to make them more exciting.
We saw that in those stunts where they depend and are flavored in a large measure to the weapon that you're using, whether it's a piercing weapon, a slashing weapon, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So we're in a really interesting space, I think, just to back up and look at it overall, where we got two systems that are basically 5e plus. I think Black Flag's going to have a hard time of it if D&D doesn't fumble again. If D&D stays open, they're going to be the reigning champs. They're both making all these changes to the basic rules, which will make them significantly different, but still roughly compatible. Hopefully they learn from each other and they both come out with better systems. But
there's a school of thought you could take where the Black Flag stuff is a way for this particular set of designers who aren't on the Wizards team to make recommendations to the Wizards team.
Exactly.
The question is the Wizards team willing to take an idea that they find here that they really like Magic Sense, say, that's just sort of a no-brainer, and putting that in a playtest version of the Wizard, and do they credit Kobold and say, hey, we saw this first in Kobold and we really liked it, so we thought we'd put it in our playtest?
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to see them do that.
Yeah.
I had a thought about Magic Missile.
Okay, I'm on it now.
There. And the create familiar changes from find familiar are interesting too. But
yeah,
one of the things that has just annoyed me about D&D in this edition is the discussion about whether Magic Missile, whether you roll for each missile or once for all missiles. That whole debate.
Mm-hmm.
That rules as written, you roll once, and that's how much damage each missile does.
Yeah.
And as intended, I think they've said that it's not that, but the way the rules are written, that is the proper interpretation. And I don't know, because we don't have the related rules in this packet that in the player's handbook, the 2014 player's handbook, make that rule, that interpretation, one roll for all missiles, right. So we can't see if they're fixing that. But here, even I wish that the language were a little bit clearer to make it explicit here, one way or the other, what their intention is.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'd just love to see that get fixed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't even totally care which way they go. I think it's more fun to roll for each missile, but I get that it's wrong.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, I will always do it, but I get that it's wrong.
They will fix that. I'll bet you that will happen.
Yeah.
Nobody even knew that for years.
Yeah.
Yeah, there were a few rules that came. It's surprising. There were a few rules that came into 5e that's I didn't see get used for the first 2, 3, 4 years of it, and then all of a sudden, I was doing it wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. Crossbow Expert was that. The most broken way you can make a character. No one really figured it out for the first couple years, and then they said, "Oh, this is what the rule lets me do," and then they never close the loopholes. So.
Yeah.
All right.
Does anybody else read Find Familiar or whatever it's called now?
Yeah.
You can't change the form of your familiar once you pick it unless you die?
Nope.
That's interesting.
And it costs you a hit point?
Yeah.
That's a bit of flavor that probably isn't worth the extra paragraph.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is definitely not succinct in its description. That's for sure.
It's also interesting that it's always construct instead of beast.
Yeah.
I would love to see that be flavorable. So maybe it's Fey instead of Beast, or Fiend instead of Beast. Either. I mean, is it a summoned little imp, or is it a homunculus I made, or is it a something else? I mean, is it a bit of my shadow that I've split off? There's so many different ways to go with that.
Yeah.
And maybe that's flavor they can do in other whatever they're calling subclasses for
The circles, right? So you got the arcane circle.
yeah.
So arcane, evidently, and they talk about what the different circles represent. They have arcane. Where is it? Schools of magic. Nope, that's schools. Permanent. Okay, here we are. So arcane draws its power from the manipulation of measurable forces that govern material reality. And then, so that's maybe why they're going with the construct. Weird could be an abjuration.
Mm-hmm.
Not abjuration.
Aberration.
Aberration. Yep. Divine could be celestial
Or fiendish.
or fiendish. Primordial could be a beast.
That makes
or
some
Fey,
sense.
or
Fey, yeah. But at the same time, so it's weird. I wonder if they're going to be hardcore on a lot of this arcane stuff to be more mechanical, more fireball-y and things like that, and less weird stuff like Everett's Black Tentacles.
You know, it makes it'll be interesting to see if sorcerer then fits into primordial or weird instead of arcane, because it's not sort of science-y.
Mm-hmm.
Right, I can see that having potential to add some flavor to warlocks and so on, with a different direction to their spell lists.
Mm-hmm. While I'm here, we got this Touch of Luck talent, which you can't use with any of the characters in the playtest, but shows you what they're thinking of doing with the luck skill.
Let me just go on a little trip back to the fighter in the stunt points that they've got, where you get a number of stunt points equal to your proficiency bonus +1. And then you can spend your stunt points to do things like riposte and parry. And that leads me to sort of a pet peeve of mine that I don't think bothers most folks, but it always bothers me. This is a point that you're getting that's obviously a very gamey resource with no particular in-game world reasons for it existing. Why would a new fighter only be able to parry up to 3 times per day? There's no reason for it. It's just a gamey sort of construct to put a limit on the resources. And that kind of thing has always bothered me from a sense of immersion into the character of what they can do and how that makes sense in the game world. I get that 4E leaned heavily on those sorts of gamey resources with daily powers to martial classes. But we saw them kind of disappear in 5th edition with their change of direction to everything in 4th edition is gone and we're going back to the game's roots. So I'm a little disappointed when I see them coming back here in Black Flag, and I see them also coming back to a little bit of a lesser degree in OneD&D. But I recognize designers absolutely love these kinds of resources because they're so useful and they open up so much design space. I guess I'm kind of resigned to seeing them as a part of the game, but it still bothers me that there's no game world rationale for why you would have a certain number of stunt points that enable you to parry.
You know, I way back in 1st edition, one of the things that really drew me to rogues initially was the idea that, well, thieves back then, they had their abilities. They weren't as good as spells, but you could do it all day long. There weren't those limits, and that lasted for quite some time. But I still really like the idea, and even the current 5th edition rogue, most of their abilities aren't limited by times of day. You can do cunning actions every round. You can do sneak attack every round. A lot of their really basic abilities aren't expendable. And even something like Uncanny Dodge, you can use once every round with your reaction. So the limitation is your reaction,
And
not
your time.
yeah. And so that I'm agreeing with you. I think that but the Battle Master fighter had limited resources and stuff like that. So it's depending upon which subclass you were playing, whether you would have limitations as a fighter. The champion didn't. The Battle Master did. Some of the other, like arcane whatever's had and battle mages or blade singers, whatever the fighter spellcaster was, the elven one.
Eldritch something. Eldritch
Yeah.
Knight.
Eldritch Knight. So they have, because they have spells, they have some limited resources.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's always been a mix. So I guess I'm less bothered by this as an option. But it's interesting to see this go into the core class.
Yeah, I would want to see a
I don't think
champion
this is core
style
class.
fighter.
This
What
is
is that?
Weapon Master class.
Oh, it's the Weapon Master?
Yeah, it's a
Oh, okay.
subclass.
Yeah.
So it's basically a mimic of the Battle Master. And it's interesting that you bring up 4E, Dave, because I seem to remember the Battle Master, them speaking of it as the 4E version of the 5e fighter. It had all these daily, quote, daily powers or, quote, encounter powers that were a little bit, a little bit cool. If you took out the extra damage they all do, they could all be almost like fighter things that any fighter could do. But yeah, I mean, I see your point. I don't know what you do to get rid of it except get rid of the subclass and all those things.
Yeah.
Or
So I guess
so they use resources that are actions and they don't do extra damage.
Yeah, for the majority of people who aren't bothered by this sort of thing, that's a fine class to play. For me, who wants a fighter character like the champion that I can hand to people sitting down at the table for their first D&D game, which I get all the time, when I run at stores, I want something that's dead simple to play without any kind of resources.
Yeah, and let's see, they rolled in. Where did they roll in the champion stuff? I think it rolled into the base class. Wind up. No. There was somewhere I saw they rolled in, like, you crit more often. That might be under Weapon Master. Mastery. Stunts. Oh, yeah, criticals on 19 or 20. So they rolled the champions extra criticals into the effective Battle Master, and they dropped the champion as a choice. And I agree with you, David. There should be like a base subclass for every class that's dead simple.
Yeah.
But nearly equal in power.
Yep.
Yeah.
So always a very useful thing for teaching new players.
Yeah. All right. I think that's all I got. So we're going to see the next playtest for OneD&D next month. The survey is open right now for the Druid and the Paladin. So go tell them how much you don't want Smite to crit ever. And Dave will be happy.
I'm here to spoil your fun.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
See y'all later.
Folks.